In March, the former Brazilian president and Workers' Party leader, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, popularly known as Lula, was charged in a vast corruption scandal linked to the state-owned oil company Petrobras. Brazilian prosecutors claimed that Operation Lava Jato, or Operation Car Wash, the official inquiry into the scandal, found evidence of $2 billion being siphoned from the firm into private hands. Some of that money, it is alleged, went to Lula. In the background to this is a major political backlash led by the middle-class right against almost 14 years of Workers' Party rule. And the investigation is fueling this increasingly rabid campaign. Last year, over 500,000 Brazilian right-wingers protested in 60 cities across the country, demanding the resignation of then-President Dilma Rousseff. And one of the slogans, according to The Guardian, was, "Brazil does not want and will not be a new Venezuela." Another banner called openly for a coup, saying, "Army, Navy and Air Force, please save us once again of communism." The protests have continued with 5 successive nationwide mobilizations over the last year, with the New York Times reporting up to 500,000 in Sao Paulo alone. The paper interviewed a protester who argued, "The first thing that needs to be done is to put Dilma and Lula in jail. They are merely communists in disguise who created a bloated state while their party profited from systematic corruption." The neoconservative American Enterprise Institute, seizing on the protests, lauds a chance to make grassroots capitalism succeed. So what is behind the right-wing campaign? In part, it is a sign of despair. Rousseff has won 2 presidential elections in a row, with 54% of the vote in 2010 and 52% in 2014, bringing the stretch of Workers' Party governments to 4 in a row. There was even the possibility, if this continued, that Lula, with the highest approval ratings of any Brazilian president, could run again for president in 2018. And one wouldn't know this if one relied on the Financial Times, which summarily dismissed twice-elected Rousseff as Brazil's least popular president ever. Yet the irony is that this anti-communist reflux is happening just as the government is implementing austerity measures. Rousseff, having campaigned on promises to increase social spending, has carried out a volte-face demanding cuts across the board from health to welfare in the middle of the country's worst recession in decades. She is reported in the Wall Street Journal as saying, "Growth requires fiscal stability," exactly the same argument as that deployed by Austerian politicians in Europe. Meanwhile, the Brazilian Democratic Movement Party, which until recently was an official ally of the Workers' Party in Congress, is pushing for an even more severe austerity agenda, which even the Financial Times, which somehow characterizes Rousseff's cuts plan as leftist, says reads like a wish list from markets and investors with proposals to liberalize industrial relations and reform pensions and government spending. So the judicial investigation and the decline in Rousseff's support as a result of her embrace of austerity politics is giving confidence to a radical right-wing movement intent on removing an elected president. In fact, there is more to this than coincidence. Of course, the investigation goes much further than seeking to incriminate leaders of the Workers' Party, and it would be difficult to know from the reporting in English that, as the Brazilian news site Congresso in Foco reports, there are active criminal proceedings against 26% of members of the Brazilian Congress, or that the opposition parties that are seeking Rousseff's resignation are just as implicated. The Guardian, reporting in detail on Brazil's crisis, only mentions in passing the fact that the opposition leader, Echo Neves, has also been implicated by the investigation. But nor would one get any sense from the same reporting of the way in which the investigation has become politicized. The federal judge behind the investigation, Sergio Moro, engineered Lula's unannounced arrest in full glare of the media. Police used force despite the fact that Lula was already cooperating with the investigation, and subsequently, when Rousseff moved to appoint Lula to the cabinet, the judge leaked an illegally tapped phone call which, though it contained no incriminating evidence, has been used to insinuate that the cabinet appointment was designed to protect Lula from investigation, as reported by The Guardian. Moro has also welcomed the protests, declaring his gratitude to the Brazilian people and arguing, as reports in The Guardian, that it is important that the elected authorities and political parties listen to the voice on the streets. Sean Purdy, writing at Jacobin, points out that many of the key judges and prosecutors are tied to the opposition parties. And notwithstanding this, the press generally blames the Workers' Party. As The Economist put it, the ferocity on both sides risks damaging the consensus that underpins the country's admirable democracy. The Workers' Party and its allies are the worst offenders. Having previously supported Lula and defended Rousseff, the magazine now says it's time to go. And while acknowledging that the allegations against Rousseff are unproven and that her impeachment would be unwarranted, the magazine insists that her attempt to appoint Lula to her cabinet put the narrow interests of her political tribe over the rule of law. The Financial Times, bizarrely enough, goes so far as to accuse Rousseff of orchestrating a coup against herself by inviting Lula to join the cabinet. Why has the press turned against a moderate, pro-capitalist party that is now willingly sacrificing its political support in order to implement austerity? The hostility from the pro-business press is all the more remarkable, given that it was once a claque for the Brazilian Workers' Party. When Lula first stepped down as president in 2010, The Economist carried a glowing account of Lula's legacy, crediting him with economic growth, job creation, and rising incomes. Even amid the furore of Operation Car Wash, and as it demanded Rousseff's resignation, The Economist couldn't help but sigh wistfully over Lula's record in office, where he combined the pragmatism of a trade union leader with a determination to help Brazil's poor, and, unlike Chavez, he didn't harass business. The Wall Street Journal lauded Lula's ample credibility with financial markets earned after his success in taming inflation and paying off the International Monetary Fund loans ahead of schedule. The New York Times admired Lula for staying well within the accepted covenants of global capitalism, and Newsweek hailed Lula as the most popular politician on earth. This admiration was not universal, however, even at the New York Times. The newspaper's foreign correspondent Larry Roter made it a hobby to attack Lula for all sorts of actual or alleged failings. In 2004, he reported that Lula's fondness for a glass of beer had become a national concern, a claim for which he was forced to apologize, as NBC reports. Roter had previously made his name defending the Venezuelan putsch and describing it as an uprising. But even he praised Lula as moderate and pragmatic in a later piece. Newsweek expressed disillusionment when it spotted troubling signs of Lula's backtracking from neoliberal orthodoxy, and later chastised Lula for spending public money with abandon, what it called checkbook populism. Later, Lula's foreign policy would incite overseas ire. Brazil's willingness to give shelter to the Honduran leader Manuel Zelaya, overthrown in a US-backed coup, was derided by Newsweek, which claimed Brazil had become a biased broker in the affair. The 2010 decision to forge a deal with Iran to exchange uranium led the New York Times to decry a spot on his legacy, citing the condemnations of opposition figures. Predictably, Thomas Friedman was outraged, calling the deal as ugly as it gets. And notwithstanding these occasional groans and tuts of disappointment in the errant protégé, the warmth shown to Lula by the international media was unlike anything extended to any other Latin American leader. So what changed? In part, the credit crunch changed global alignments. In the short term, the Brazilian government managed to recover far more rapidly from the global crisis than other countries by using public spending to stimulate the economy. For as long as this sustained growth, Brazil's business class was largely happy with this state of affairs, which continued under Dilma Rousseff, Lula's appointed successor. However, Dilma Rousseff was never extended the same admiration as Lula, and was considered to be to his left. Under Rousseff, the government embarked on a series of counter-cyclical fiscal initiatives throughout 2011 and 2012 that went further than Lula's governments had. By the time of the 2014 Brazilian election, in which Rousseff was running on a platform of high social spending, the economic winds were changing. Stagnant economies in Europe and North America meant that exports declined and a trade deficit opened up. And in part because of this, the counter-cyclical measures didn't restore Brazilian capitalism to root health, only opened up a growing budget deficit. Some sectors of business were tiring of the Workers' Party and wanted a more aggressively pro-business, pro-cuts party in office. And the international business press tended to reflect this point of view. The New York Times business editor lauded the opposition leader as a pro-growth, market-friendly candidate, noted that Brazil's stock market surges when he is in the lead and plunges when he is not, and dismissed Rousseff as a pro-Chavez former Marxist guerrilla. When Rousseff was re-elected, however, she immediately promised to implement austerity measures in an attempt to reassure business and get investment going again. Yet she has struggled to persuade the business press that she is serious. The Economist, writing at the time, urged that the government's newfound monetary and fiscal rectitude should be taken with caution. There seems to be little the government can do to win back the trust of business, but at the same time, having spent so long seeking the approval of business before all else, and having cleaved to the covenants of global capitalism, they can do little else but try. And the irony is that the corruption charges against Lula derive from his successful incorporation into global capitalism. Like other leaders from the neoliberal centre, such as Blair and Clinton, he has been rewarded with outsized speaker fees totaling $8 million, in his case from the construction industry. That is what has come back to bite him and the Workers' Party.